Hi everyone, my name is Nabil Alsharif, and today I want to be talking about the anatomy of Bitcoin transactions. We're going to focus just on the transactions, but we're going to talk about them a little bit in detail. But first, a little bit about me. Name's Nabil Alsharif, you got that one already. I'm an information security consultant at Blip Tech, and I'm also a software developer at Shelter Insurance. And you can reach me at nabil@blip.tech. And just a quick refresher on blockchains themselves. I don't know if any of you guys were here during that presentation, but a blockchain, you have a header, and the whole idea is that if block 2 is created, block 2 guarantees that block 1 had to be created before block 2 was, and that none of the data inside of block 2 has changed. And part of the data inside of the header is basically a hash of the data that the blockchain contains. So by extension, it guarantees that the data in block 1 existed before block 2 and hasn't changed since the time that block 2 was created.
So you're saying what, that block 2 has a checksum or a hash of everything in itself plus all the previous?
It has a hash of the header of the previous block, and then the previous header actually has a hash of the Martel root of the data.
Okay.
So you kind of have this ties them all in together, and then the proof of work part guarantees that 1 existed before 2. This by itself, without the proof of work, you could just alter 1, make up a new header, alter 2. The proof of work part guarantees that block 1 existed before block 2 was created.
Okay.
But that's kind of an aside. We'll come back to it just a little bit towards the end. I just want to give that refresher because the data is the transactions. The data that the blocks contain are the transactions, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And in Bitcoin transactions, a transaction is simply a record of transferring the output of a previous transaction to a new output, or outputs from previous transactions to new outputs. Very simple concept. That's the end of it. But we're going to have to go over some glossary, some terms we'll be using around here. A Bitcoin address. Your Bitcoin address is literally the hash of your public key. And we'll talk about why the public key comes in the future. Transaction ID. The transaction ID is the hash of the transaction data. There is no explicit transaction ID field or something that is generated. It is the hash value of the transaction's data. UTXO is unspent transaction outputs. These are outputs from a transaction that have not been spent by a subsequent transaction. We'll explain that one a little bit later too. A couple more terms we'll be throwing around and we'll explain them some more a little bit as we go along is a public key script. A public key script is a script that defines who or how this output could be spent. And the signature script verifies that, yes, I have the authority. Basically, it confirms the public key script. It says, I prove that I have the authority to spend this output because of my script. And the Coinbase transaction is a very special type of transaction, and it is the transaction that people will throw around the term creates a new Bitcoin, but that's actually not true. What it is, it's the transaction that contains the miner's reward from mining the block. Again, we'll explain what that means as we go through here. Yes?
Quick question. On the Coinbase transaction, is that actually related to Coinbase IO? Is that something that they did, or is that something that already existed within Bitcoin?
It's something that existed within Bitcoin, and Coinbase got their name from the term in Bitcoin.
That's cool.
Transactions are really just data structures. They pile them up next to each other, and that's what creates a block. And each transaction is a 4-byte version number, which right now is always 1. There's only one version of the structure. There are 0 to 2 bytes for flags. Again, those are currently unused. The important thing is there is transaction in count. That is the number of input transactions for this whole transaction. And then after that, you have the input transactions themselves, and we'll look at what the input transactions look like. And they reference previous transactions. And then you have the outputs, which are contained within the transaction, and you have the outputs themselves. And then the lock time is not used, and it's currently always 0. All of this whole structure is hashed, and that is the transaction ID. And we'll come into the transaction ID when we start talking about input transaction structure. You have an ID of the previous output. So you have a transaction where James has sent me 3 Bitcoins. Okay? So the output of James' transaction is a script that says whoever owns this public key can spend this output. So my transaction to spend those coins will, and someone's at the door. My transaction will reference James' transaction through its transaction ID and say, I'm going to spend this output, or this is going to be one of the outputs that I'm using in this new transaction that I'm creating. So you reference both the transaction ID and the output index, because the transaction could have more than one output. And then you have the script length and the script itself, and we'll discuss the script in a little bit. And then a 4-byte sequence that is not used right now. An output transaction, just to clarify, this script is the public keys as the signature script that is used to confirm that I have the power to use or consume that previous output. The output transactions has its value, which is basically how much this person is allowed to spend. The public key part of the script, which says under what conditions these coins could be spent, and the actual script. So there's some implications that come out of this data structure. The first one is that a transaction must spend the full value of the outputs that it consumes. So back to the example where James has a transaction assigning an output to me, I have to spend that whole output. Now he might have 1,000 and I only want to spend 500. In that case, my transaction would have 2 outputs. It would have one output of 500 to whoever is supposed to get that, and then another output of 500 assigning the rest to myself. And that's usually called a change output. Another implication is, since you have multiple outputs in a transaction, some of those outputs could have been spent while others couldn't. And this leads to some complications, because if I'm looking at James' transaction and I only have a record up to a certain point in time, then his output might have been spent by the time I go in and process everything I need to do to go and spend it. And that's one of the versions of the double spend problem. There are other things that get around that, but we're not going to go into that much detail. And that's the third implication, is that 2 transactions could try to spend the same output. And that is the double spend problem you guys will hear about sometimes. And we talked about scripts a lot, and we kind of tapered over them. Scripts, well, before we do this, does anyone have any questions up until now about the structure or anything related to that?
There's a lot there. to absorb if you've never seen it before.
Okay.
But I don't know how to formulate a question.
I would say the highlight to grasp is that the transaction was created. That transaction has a number of outputs. Each one of those outputs says, these are the conditions in which this money could be spent. In order to spend that money, you have to create a new transaction which references what you're trying to spend and proves or has a script that satisfies the conditions necessary to be able to spend that money. That, I would say, is the core concept of what is going on.
When you talk about a script, I'm assuming this, you mean like an executable type of script?
Yes, actually.
Okay, so
Well,
this is a distributed architecture. Who runs this script? Is it the, it seems like if you want, this is a secure type situation, wouldn't want the person who's proposing the transaction also authenticated with the script? Or am I missing something
yes.
altogether?
Yeah, actually, we're right to get to that
Oh.
with scripts. You're right. The entity that runs the scripts are the miners. Well, there's a couple of people. So you creating a transaction have read the script and know that, oh yes, this script authorizes or I can satisfy the conditions I need to spend it. Also, the miners run the scripts because they need to execute them to verify that everything checks out, so to speak. So it is kind of where the magic happens. We'll talk about the magic. But to alleviate some of your questions, the script is a language. It is stack-based, so there are opcodes, but they all live in a stack. It's not Turing complete, so you're guaranteed that the execution time will complete, so you can't write infinite. Basically, the things that you can write is very limited, and the scripting construct itself guarantees that the execution will complete within a set period of time, actually. And it's stateless, so you don't need to worry about any outside variables or anything. The whole script goes on the stack. That's your memory. You push and pop things off of the stack at the end, you get a value. And you can pretty much guarantee how many steps that's going to take for you to finish executing the script. And we'll talk about that in a second. Another way that they control what you were worried about is that the standard scripts are standardized. So they're very specific formula that says you have this opcode, then you have this opcode, then this piece of data, then this opcode, then this piece of data. And for a pay to a public key, this is the script you will use. And if you try to create a transaction that deviates from these standard scripts, the miners will reject them. And finally, the signature script, which is what confirms you have the power to spend an output, is prepended to the public key script, which is what sets up the conditions for when you can spend that output. And we'll show a couple examples, but before we do that, I want to talk about the standard scripts. Yes?
So earlier when you're talking about the inputs and outputs needing to be equivalent, does that kind of imply then that they're immutable? Like
Yes.
the coins themselves?
The transactions are immutable.
Okay.
Yes, the transactions have to be immutable. Because if you could change the transaction, then you could start changing how much money gets spent. And nobody wants that.
Okay.
The standard script, the three scripts you'll see the most, the first one is pay to a public key hash. This is used when you are paying someone else, a single entity, some money. So in the example where I like you paying me money, James, and where James is paying me 1,000 Satoshis, in that situation, he would most likely be using a pay to a public key hash where he would be saying, and then he would be using my public key. So he would hash my public key and he says, whoever owns this public key can spend this output. Pay to a script hash basically lets you pay, say whoever, this is the script, and whoever owns that script creates a script that matches and can verify it, has the ability to pay to use this output. And that one's a little bit more complicated, a little bit less common. And then the third type is a multi-signature. So this is when, for example, you have 2 of 3 people, think of an escrow account. So I set up a payment that says these coins can be spent if 2 of these 3 people agree to where those coins should be spent. So think escrow account is the biggest example. You are buying something, and you put in an account, either the buyer and the seller both agree that the seller gets the money, or the buyer on the escrow account agree that the seller gets the money, or the buyer and the escrow account agree that the buyer gets its money back. 2 of 3. There are a couple other standard scripts. There's the public key, which was a simplified early version of the pay to a public key hash that's not used anymore, but you will see it in older transactions, still accepted by miners though. And the null data transaction, this lets you spend coins to store data on the blockchain. So when you hear about people talking about, oh, they're storing data on the blockchain, if they're doing it on the Bitcoin blockchain, specifically the Bitcoin blockchain, then they're using a null data transaction. So now that we talked about this all a lot, let's see how this actually works. Go through a practical example. This is the pay to public key hash. And we are actually going to walk through this step by step to see how this is evaluated. But the public key script says, check the signature. First of all, duplicate whatever comes first, which happens to be the public key. Hash it. Make sure it's equal to the hash that I expect it to be. And if it is, then check the signature of the transaction matches using that public key. And it's a little complicated, so we're going to do this step by step. So the first operation that gets executed is the duplicate operation, which consumes one item off the stack, namely the public key, and it will duplicate it. So our stack ends up looking like this. We have 2 copies of the public key now on the stack. The next operation is to calculate the hash of that value, and it will consume it, and wrong button, and put it on the stack. So now we have 2 copies of the public key hash after each other. And the next operation is the equal verify. And this will not place a new value on the stack, but if these 2 values are not equal, then think of it as like an interrupt and the execution ends, and that's considered a failure. Assuming they are equal, then what you're going to have left is the signature of the transaction and the public key and the special operation that says make sure that this signature is a signature of the transaction by whoever owns this public key. So if I created the transaction, I own the public key, I have the private key, I sign the whole transaction, create the signature, put my public key after that, everything should be happy. And you can guarantee that was me, or me that created the transaction. The person that owned the private key to that public key created that transaction. And you end up with a true, which means everything's good and the conditions to spend this output have been satisfied. Should we go through that one again?
We like spending.
Should we go through it again, or do you guys feel comfortable with it?
It's the 5 steps to happiness, right?
What?
Is it 5 steps to happiness? Or 5 ops here? Hash,
yeah.
equalify, check sig. That's 4 operations, and then you get to the true.
Yes. 4 operations, you get to the true.
All right.
We're not gonna go through the evaluation of the rest of the ones, because I didn't do it. But the next one is pay to a script hash. So this would be used, for example, I have very special conditions in which this coin could be spent, and James is paying me, but I want him to pay me directly. I want him to pay somebody else who might meet these conditions. So let's say I want James to pay, not to pay me, I want him to pay money into this escrow account. So I would set up a multi-signature transaction, and I would hash that transaction, and I would give that hash to James, and I would say, okay, James, you're going to set up a transaction that pays to whoever meets the conditions of this script that I've created, that I've set up. That way, I don't particularly own the coins, they go straight to this escrow account. That's an example situation where pay to a script hash transaction might be used. Multi-signature scripts are basically they're kind of their own operation. They're a special thing that says if X out of Y signers have signed the transaction correctly, then the transaction is valid. Then the output can be spent. Escrow accounts is a big example. Pay to a public key. This is the old simple transaction that is not used anymore, but you will still see it around every once in a while. And it basically was just check the signature of this public key, really sign the transaction that was being created. If you notice, this is the very last part of the pay to public key hash. And last but not least is the Coinbase transaction. The Coinbase transactions are created by miners. It's always the first transaction in the block, and it has no inputs. And its outputs is the block reward. So any, an example. Again, James is giving me money. James gives me 1,000. I spend 50, and then I have a change to myself of 750. There's that 250 difference left over. That is the mining fee. When you hear about people speaking about mining fee, that's the mining fee. And that is money that is left over that hasn't been spent, and it's been left intentionally unspent, because it's the mining fee. And the miner will collect all of that, and that is the fee for the block. And then early blocks have subsidies, which basically allows them to, I hate to say the word, create a new Bitcoin, because it's a good analogy, but it's not correct. What it means is that they basically get free money for doing this transaction, for creating this block, and it only lasts for a specific amount of time. We're not going to go into the details of that. But the conclusion, what comes out of all of this, is that Bitcoins themselves, there is no entity Bitcoin. If you go and you look at the blockchain, there is no Bitcoin structure. There is no thing that is being transmitted that is the Bitcoin. What the Bitcoin is, if I have a Bitcoin wallet, the quote-unquote Bitcoins in my wallet are really just the sum of the unspent outputs that I have the ability to spend. So if I want to calculate how many Bitcoins I have, I will look through the history of the blockchain, through all of the transactions, and I will see what transactions have outputs that are assigned to me that haven't been spent yet. And those are my Bitcoins. Any questions? Yes.
How long would it take to parse the entire, blockchain in history to determine what you just said?
Not long.
Yeah.
I think, I really don't know how big it is. I know it's in the gigs, as in like, I think it's like, I don't want to say because they'll probably be wrong.
No, that's fine.
But they have some tricks up their sleeves, so older transactions that have definitely been completely spent can be pruned,
Okay.
and things like that, so that you don't have to, full nodes will have to parse it, but they're full nodes. But if you're just running a wallet on your machine, then chances are you will not be running a full node and you won't parse the entire history.
So how many gigs can it grow to before it becomes too unwieldy?
Impractical, yeah.
Impractical, unwieldy.
That is one of the concerns. It's laid out explicitly. The expectation is that storage capacity will grow faster than the blockchain will. Basically, if we keep up with Moore's law, then the speed and processing power and storage capacity of computers will grow faster than the blockchain will. And that's kind of the assumption that people go off of. But in practicality, it could grow infinitely in size. In theory, it could grow infinitely.
Okay.
Yes.
Was there a particular reason against, say, a design in which there were blocks that would be inserted as checkpoints, such that you would have, say, a sum of all the public keys and their current sum up to a certain point within the chain for the purpose of efficiency?
You can't have a sum of the public keys because I might create a public key on the fly. There's nothing that prevents me from just creating a new public key right
So I'd
now.
have to sum of the public keys, but the sum of the total of the transactions that correspond to a particular public key.
I don't know. I can say a lot. I think a lot. I don't know. I can't say this is the answer. This is exactly why. If I would have to take a guess, I would say that it's probably because it doesn't add anything that can't be computed. So if you're running a full node, the expectation is that you're doing all the things. And so you would want to verify everything yourself. So even if there is some kind of checkpoint block, that still has to be verified. So a full node would still have to download everything. It would still have to verify everything because it needs to verify that block too. If you're not a full node, then you're trusting a third party anyway. Since you're trusting the third party anyway, that's between you and them to deal with it. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Any other questions? Well, thank you guys very much. Sorry if I lost you guys. And yeah, see you all next month. Thank you.